There continues to be debate surrounding the assassination of President John F. Kennedy on November 22, 1963, in Dallas, Texas. Was it a lone nut named Lee Harvey Oswald acting on his own, or some dark and complex conspiracy? President Lyndon Johnson created the Warren Commission, led by Chief Justice Earl Warren, to investigate Kennedy's assassination. They were unable to find any evidence for a conspiracy and concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald was the lone self-motivated assassin. Still, polls have indicated that most people continue to believe in some form of conspiracy. One of the primary reasons often cited is the short timing of under 6 seconds for 3 shots from a bolt-action rifle. They argue that few shooters would be able to operate the bolt between each shot and aim the shots accurately in such a short time frame. Consequently, they believe such short timing would require at least 2 shooters. It is widely believed that the Warren Commission determined that 3 shots were fired in under 6 seconds, but that is actually untrue. That short timing was only if the second of 3 gunshots missed. If the first shot missed, then the timing would have to be longer than 7.9 seconds. A local businessman named Abraham Zapruder had used his home movie camera to film the presidential motorcade as it passed by Dealey Plaza. There are 2 separate shot reactions in under 6 seconds which are visible in that film. The first visible wounding reaction was when President Kennedy is seen with his hands clutching at his throat, and a second reaction a few seconds later, when he is struck in his head. If the first reaction was from the first shot, then the 3 shots would have had to have been fired in under 6 seconds, which is the time between the visible reactions. The short timing would seem a difficult feat for a bolt-action rifle and raised suspicions. Many questioned if one gunman could have gotten off 3 shots in that time. But many people remain unaware that the commission never determined which of 3 shots missed and wrote that if either the first or third shots missed, then the timing would be at least 7 seconds or longer. It's unfortunate that they apparently failed to recognize the evidence presented here. This video will analyze the objectively convincing evidence, showing that the first shot missed, and the timing was sufficient for 3 aimed shots from a bolt-action rifle. It should be a given that witness testimony, which can be objectively confirmed using visual film evidence, should be given more weight and credibility than opposing testimony without such observable support. And testimony which can be positively refuted by clear film evidence should be dismissed. This video will correlate multiple independent testimonies, which reference unique, specific and observable sequential movements observed in the Zapruder film, to show that the first shot missed, and the timing was sufficiently reasonable for 3 aimed shots from a bolt-action rifle. First, we need to consider the testimony of Governor Connally, and how it precisely corresponds to his movements seen in the Zapruder film beginning at about frame number 160, as is seen when correlated with the relevant quotes from his Warren Commission testimony. Sequentially, we see Connally seated in the jump seat in front of President Kennedy, first turn to his right then begin turning left. Emerging from behind the road sign he begins reacting, as his right lapel flaps out, his shoulders rise up, his face contorts, and he doubles over. He begins turning to his right a second time and seems to sit there before falling back to his wife's lap shortly before Kennedy's head explodes. Listen to Governor Connally's testimony and notice how it precisely parallels his movements seen in this slow-motion clip from the Zapruder film. Governor Connally is seated in front of President Kennedy on the right side of the limousine.
We had just made the turn and I heard this noise, which I immediately took to be a rifle shot. I instinctively turned to my right because the sound appeared to come from over my right shoulder, and I saw nothing unusual except just people in the crowd failing to see him. I was turning to look back over my left shoulder into the back seat, but I never got that far in my turn. And then I felt like someone had hit me in the back. So I merely doubled up and then turned to my right again, and I just sat there. And Mrs. Connally pulled me over to her lap, and then, of course, the third shot sounded. And I heard the shot very clearly. I heard it hit him. I heard the shot hit something, and I assumed again it never entered my mind that it ever hit anybody but the president. I heard it hit. It was a very loud noise, just that audible, very clear. Immediately I could see on my clothing, I could see on the interior of the car, which, as I recall, was a pale blue brain tissue, which I immediately recognized, and I recall very well. On my trousers there was one chunk of brain tissue as big as almost my thumbnail.
Next, we will correlate Mrs. Kennedy's testimony to her movements seen in the Zapruder film. She is very clear that she failed to recognize the sound of the first shot, but she heard Governor Connally exclaim, "Oh, no, no, no," which she said caused her to turn from looking towards the crowds on her left to turn to look at her husband sitting on her right. In the Zapruder film, she is seen turning to her right towards her husband immediately after Connolly turns to his right. These independent, sequential movements of Governor Connolly and Mrs. Kennedy provide further interconnected corroboration for a first shot which must have occurred before Governor Connolly made that turn to his right at around Zapruder frame 160.
Mrs. Kennedy is easily recognized by the pink hat she is wearing, and can be seen in the following slow-motion clip, turning towards her husband immediately after Connolly turned to his right. The following relevant portions of her testimony, related to her turn, sequentially conforms to Connolly's turn, providing objective corroboration to show that a missed first shot had already occurred at some point prior to Connolly's turn.
You know, there is always noise in a motorcade, and there are always motorcycles beside us, a lot of them backfiring. So I was looking to the left. I guess there was a noise, but it didn't seem like any different noise really, because there is so much noise, motorcycles and things. But then suddenly Governor Connolly was yelling, "Oh, no, no, no." I was looking this way, to the left, so I turned to the right. The one that made me turn around was Governor Connolly yelling. But I heard Governor Connolly yelling, and that made me turn around.
So far, we have Governor Connolly testifying to turning to his right immediately after hearing a gunshot, and describing in detail his specific sequential movements during the assassination. We have seen how his testimony perfectly aligns with his movements in the Zapruder film. Also, Mrs. Kennedy explained in detail that she tuned to her right to look towards her husband only because she heard Governor Connolly say, "Oh, no, no." Taken together, this evidence objectively shows a missed shot had already occurred prior to frame 160 when Governor Connolly begins turning to his right. A witness by the name of Phil Willis also described Mrs. Kennedy turning after the first shot. He was taking pictures of the motorcade as it passed his position at the corner of Elm and Houston Streets. During his testimony, he twice volunteered that he witnessed Mrs. Kennedy turn towards President Kennedy immediately after he heard the first shot. Mrs. Kennedy only turns once, and she remains facing the president until after he is hit in the head. Willis's testimony is further confirmation that Mrs. Kennedy turned after the first shot, and by extension, logically corroborates Governor Connolly's turn after the first shot. Mr. Willis was asked if he could tell whether President Kennedy had been hit by the first shot or the second shot or the third shot, or by how many shots he had been hit, and said in his testimony,
"No, sir, except this one thing might be worthy of mention. When I took slide number 4, the president was smiling and waving and looking straight ahead, and Mrs. Kennedy was likewise smiling and facing more to my side of the street. When the first shot was fired, her head seemed to just snap in that direction. In slide number 4, he was looking pretty much straight ahead, and she was looking more to the left, which would be my side of the street. Then, when the first shot was fired, she turned to the right toward him."
Sam Holland is another witness who referred to Mrs. Kennedy at the time of the first shot, looking to the southern direction which would be to her left. He also referred to President Kennedy having his right arm raised, consistent with very beginning of the Zapruder film. Listen to the relevant portion of his testimony on the first shot.
"And she was looking in this direction, in the southern direction. And about that time, he went over like that and put his hand up, and she was still looking off, as well as I could tell. Pulled forward and hand just stood like that momentarily. His right hand, and that was the first report that I heard."
Bonnie Ray Williams, who was watching the parade from the 5th floor of the Texas School Book Depository, also mentioned in his testimony to noticing President Kennedy brushing his hair back at the time he heard the first shot. This is consistent with the very first few frames of the Zapruder film and may be what Sam Holland referred to with Kennedy's right arm going up.
"The last thing I remember seeing him do was, it seemed to me he had a habit of pushing his hair back. The last thing I saw him do was, he pushed his hand up like this. I assumed he was brushing his hair back. And then the thing that happened then was a loud shot."
Rosemary Willis is the little girl seen in the Zapruder film, running along with the limousine. She turns her head and slows down, which she explained was because she heard a gunshot and turned to look towards the source. She saw a flock of pigeons fly off the roof of the book depository.
As they made the turn from Houston to Elm Street, they'd just gone a few feet when the first shot rang out. And upon hearing the sound, my normal body reaction was to look up and follow the sound that I heard. It was so abrupt. I didn't know what it was, but I was looking for what I heard. And the pigeons immediately ascended off that roof of the schoolbook depository building, and that's what caught my eye. My eyes were searching for what I heard, and I see the pigeons, they're scared to death, and take off in abrupt flight.
Rosemary has turned her head by frame 144. She slows and is completely stopped by frame 188 before turning to look towards the limousine that has passed by. Her turn in the Zapruder film suggests a shot may have occurred by frame 144. Since it is only 1.5 seconds between the first Zapruder frame, which is number 133, and frame 160, when Governor Connolly begins turning to his right, it seems possible the first shot may have even occurred before Mr. Zapruder started filming the limousine. Mary Woodward worked for the Dallas News, and stood on the side of Elm Street as the motorcade passed by. She wrote an article describing the assassination which was published that afternoon of November 22. She explained that she didn't see anyone appearing to be hit by the first shot she heard, but mentioned Mrs. Kennedy turning after the sound.
I don't believe anyone was hit with the first bullet. The President and Mrs. Kennedy turned and looked around as if they too didn't believe the noise was really coming from a gun. Then after a moment's pause, there was another shot, and I saw the President start slumping in the car.
I want to mention Amos Ewens and Secret Service agent Glenn Bennett. Although they are not corroborated by the Zapruder film, they both provide credible evidence that the first shot missed. Witness Amos Ewens placed the first shot near the black and white road sign near the corner of Elm and Houston streets.
I watched the car on down the street, and about the time the car got back near the black and white sign, I heard a shot.
Secret Service agent Glenn Bennett was riding in the follow-up car. On the plane ride back to Washington after the assassination, he wrote down his recollections of the day, which he used to write his report the next day. He recalled hearing the first shot and then looking towards the President and witnessing a bullet strike the President in the back. Then he saw another bullet hit the President in the head. He wrote in his report,
I heard what sounded like a firecracker. I immediately looked from the crowd and looked towards the President, who was seated in the right rear seat of his limousine open convertible. At the moment I looked at the back of the President, I heard another firecracker noise and saw the shot hit the President about 4 inches down from the right shoulder. A second shot followed immediately and hit the right rear high of the President's head.
Now let's examine the Zapruder frames related to that single bullet. As Governor Connolly and the President emerged from behind the Stemmons Freeway sign. Connolly has been in the process of turning to his left, and appears normal in frames 222 and 223. But in 224, his right lapel has flapped up, corresponding to a bullet exiting just below his right nipple, and his face begins to contort. Between 224 and 225, Kennedy's right hand becomes visible, and is moving downwards, beginning to clench, and Connolly's left shoulder begins rising. Between 225 and 226, both of Kennedy's hands begin moving towards his throat. Connolly's left shoulder continues rising, as he appears to be hunching up, just as he described in his testimony. Both men's faces appear contorted or grimacing. Those movements occurred in a time span of only 16/100ths of a second. They continue to move simultaneously, consistent with reacting to being shot, and their visible reactions are consistent with a bullet striking between frames 223 and 224. When viewed at normal speed, their reactions appear simultaneous, as they do when analyzed frame by frame. One more credible witness I should mention is Pierce Allman, who was the program director for WFAA Radio. He had been watching from the corner of Elm and Houston. In this clip, he recalled President Kennedy brushing back his hair and Mrs. Kennedy saying, "Oh my God." He also placed the first shot near the lamp post, where Amos Ewens put it. But more importantly, on the day of the assassination, he described live on air the 3 well-spaced shots he heard. His broadcast was perhaps the very first description of the shot timing and arguably the most credible since it was uninfluenced by later media reports. Also, it is further confirmation of the evidence presented here in this video.
And Jackie had this little wave. And Mr. Kennedy would brush the hair out of his face, and then he had this sort of wave, and as they turned, I think I took a couple of steps over and said something like, "Hey, welcome to Dallas, Mr. President." And they turned the corner, and then boom, just
like,
they were.
Have it marked off with X's, right?
Well, yeah, that's the second shot and the third shot. The first shot, they were right about, with the lamppost. And Jackie was screaming, "Oh my God, they killed," she was actually, when Clint went over the left rear fender.
Seemed rapid at all. There were three well-spaced, reverberating shots.
How far were you from the car, Pierce, when the shots were fired?
The car was in the middle of the street, and I was on the left-hand side of the street. I'd say about 10 feet.
It didn't. Pierce, how many shots did you hear? You heard 3 shots.
I heard 3 well-spaced shots.
The overwhelming evidence supporting a missed shot prior to Zapruder frame 160, when Governor Connolly begins turning, is compelling and leaves no room for logical or reasonable doubt. There is simply no other credible or objectively verified evidence that stands up to scrutiny for any alternative scenario. I hope this video will provide a logical perspective to those who are interested in the JFK assassination, that they might not have heard previously. Although I find this analysis consistent, credible and logical, I am well aware from years of discussing this evidence, that many people are simply unable to accept it, and will vigorously dispute this analysis. They will look for what they believe is some inconsistency in witness statements, or argue that Governor Connolly and Mrs. Kennedy were both too traumatized to be credible. They will point to outlying witnesses who contradict this analysis, though those witnesses are without any logical objective support. In any case, their belief is insurmountable, and they will remain convinced of some other explanation that must exist somewhere, in the ether. As I stated at the beginning of the video, I consider testimony that can be verified in the Zapruder film should be provided more logical credibility than opposing or contradictory testimony that has no such objective verification. In this case, I have provided multiple, independent, credible testimonies that relate the first shot to unambiguous sequential movements seen in the Zapruder film. It is unfortunate that this evidence apparently went unrecognized by the Warren Commission. It is a critical failure of their report, which likely helped to feed conspiracy suspicions. I have speculated that some compromises may have been made in order to get a unanimous agreement of the Commission. Senator Russell believed Oswald was the shooter, but was skeptical of the single bullet. If the Warren Commission had concluded that the first bullet missed, Russell might have refused to sign. But that is only speculation. I don't know. Perhaps it was incompetence, or too little time to notice all of the interconnecting and objective details. It is much easier today to closely analyze the film evidence.
Viewers will decide for themselves, but in my humble opinion, the objective evidence presented in this video seems beyond any reasonable doubt and leads to only one logical conclusion, that the first shot missed, meaning that the timing was longer than commonly believed, and the second shot struck both men. Thank you for watching.